Bottom Toastmaster, Toastmasters, and guests. Now, you've probably heard someone say, if these walls could only speak. The implication is that the walls would tell secrets if they only could tell secrets. But sometimes walls do speak. Think about billboards and message boards. Even ordinary walls have photographs and mementos that can communicate a story. When I was growing up, the walls of our small apartment were covered with reminders of my family's past. Above our kitchen table hung a colorful map of Bermuda, my mother's homeland, the place she left when she came to America and married my father. And then in the living room, there was a painting of an African village representing Zaire, where my father grew up. And then there was this poster. It's a photograph of a carving from the Tower of London. Here's a better picture of it behind me. It showed a name, Thomas Abel, the Abel family emblem etched into the stone wall. And I was told that Thomas Abel was an ancestor, an English priest who carved his name and our family emblem while he was imprisoned there. As an adult, I became curious and I started digging into his story. And what I found inspired me so much that I decided to write a book about it. So, who was Thomas Abel? Thomas Abel was a 16th century English priest, an Oxford tutor, a musician, and a man fluent in several European languages. We only really know about Thomas's life because he got caught in the middle of one of the messiest divorces in English history. Some might even call it the most consequential breakup in European history, as it led to the English Reformation. I'm speaking, of course, of King Henry VIII and his battle to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Now, Henry and Catherine had married for 20 years. They had several children, but only one survived infancy. It was a girl. Her name was Princess Mary, but she wasn't enough. King Henry VIII feared that the Tudor dynasty would not survive without a son, and it seemed that the Queen Catherine was too old to bear another child. Rather conveniently, King Henry already had someone in mind to replace Catherine, his mistress, Anne Boleyn. He hoped Anne Boleyn would give him a prince that he wanted, but there's a problem. In 16th century Europe, you couldn't just get divorced. The Pope had personally granted Henry and Catherine permission to get married. So to undo it, Henry needed an annulment, declaring the marriage was invalid from the start. In order to do that, King Henry's chief advisor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, removed Catherine's Spanish household and he replaced them with English attendants that he believed would be loyal to the king. One of them was Thomas Abel. Now, Wolsey instructed Thomas to serve the queen as her personal confessor, but he expected him to report back to him, essentially acting as a spy. In 1529, Henry sent Thomas on a special mission to Spain to retrieve a document from the Spanish archives. But Thomas suspected that the king's motives were not purely to collect evidence. Thomas knew that that document could destroy the king's case, and so he began to suspect that the king wanted him to bring it to England to make it disappear. And Thomas was like, "Dude, wicked!" And he didn't say it ironically either. Thomas agonized about what to do next. If he disobeyed the king, he might pay for it with his life. But could he live with himself if he went along with the deception? I won't tell you what Thomas did next, but I will tell you that he began opposing the king, first secretly and then very publicly. Eventually, he was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London for 7 years. And on July 30th, 1540, Thomas Abel was executed for treason. Now, he may have been largely forgotten by people, but the walls of Thomas's cell speak loudly. Every day, hundreds of tourists walk past the carving Thomas made, even though few of them know the story about the man who made it. And I decided I wanted to do something about that. And so I began researching the story. And if any of this history about King Henry VIII and his famous divorce sounds familiar to you, it's probably because the Tudor period is one of the most written about eras in English history. It's full of kings and queens and palace intrigue. You may have seen it in movies or miniseries, or you may have read Hilary Mantel's international best-selling novel, Wolf Hall. But not many people have heard Thomas's story. They don't know the role he played in supporting Queen Catherine. Despite his mark on the wall, his voice has been largely silent. So I decided to tell Thomas's story from his point of view. I wanted to root the story in as many historical facts as possible, but I also wanted to explore his motivations and include that in my narrative. Why did he stand up for the Queen at the cost of his life? What motivated him? So 3 years ago, I began researching this story and I traveled to London. I was able to read 500-year-old records at the British Library and visit the Tower of London and actually see the carving that Thomas Abell made. And eventually, I decided to write Thomas's story as historical fiction so I could include my interpretation of his internal thoughts and motivation. I wrote The Queen's Priest, The Story of Blessed Thomas Abell, and it was just released on Amazon on July 30th, which was Thomas's feast day. So you can now get it as an ebook or in paperback on Amazon, and I'll include that link in the chat. You can also scan this QR code if you would like to join my newsletter and hear more about Thomas Abell, my research, and my ongoing historical fiction projects. They say, if only walls could talk, the secrets they would tell. But in this case, they do. Thank you for letting me share Thomas's story with you and my story about his story. Thank you, Madam Toastmaster.